From behind my pretend microphone in my parents' basement, my friends. Eric Cohn back in this week for Guy Benson, and we're talking about persuasion today, and how do we actually change not only people's minds, but how things work in Washington, D.C. One of the groups that is looking to do that, and something that caught my eye this week, one of the groups looking to really change things is the Coalition to Reduce Spending. Now, this has been likened by a number of people, the pledge, at least, that they are supporting, that they are offering, as the other half of sorts to Grover Norquist's tax pledge. So we get the tax side of the equation, but the problem is that even without promising not to raise taxes, spending continues to increase and increase and increase. And we see that even this week, the attempt to pass this no budget, no pay plan in Congress, that this is actually they thought that this is going to achieve some kind of spending reduction, to me seems laughable. And it seems that the Coalition to Reduce Spending agrees there. Jonathan Bydlak heads up the Coalition to Reduce Spending. He has been likened by some to the next Grover Norquist. I will let him comment on that as he sees fit. Jonathan joins us now. Thanks, Jonathan, for being a part of the program.
Thanks for having me. So,
your thoughts on on what was passed in Congress this week? This no budget, no pay plan. Is this going to achieve anything positive?
Well, to be honest, probably not much. There's a lot of emphasis that's put on the budget, but of course the budget is just a blueprint for how spending would be expected to occur over the next year. That, of course, doesn't mean that that's how spending will actually occur, and there's plenty of spending that occurs off budget. So, there's a lot of emphasis being put on, let's get the perfect budget out there, and that's great. I mean, we absolutely should be passing a budget. The Senate hasn't done so in over 3.5 years. But, as someone who wants to see actual, real spending reduction, just passing a budget doesn't really do that. You have to actually follow through with those cuts. And unfortunately, as you know, the sort of decision on the debt ceiling has now been, and on whether to raise the debt ceiling, whether to increase borrowing, has been pushed off from this month, January, to next month, to May.
So we've successfully kicked the can down the road, as we did with what I thought was probably one of the few real opportunities to get anything resembling necessary spending cuts, the sequestration. We just kicked that down the road as well. Do you have any optimism that we're not just going to arrive a few months from now and kick the can further down the road?
Well, I mean, if, I guess, as they say, past performance is not necessarily indicative of future performance, but if you look at the past performance of Congress and the recent performance of Congress, it is a little tough to be optimistic. The tough thing about sequestration, of course, is that the spending cuts that are contained in sequestration, which, I should add, are not actually real cuts anyway. They're basically cuts from a baseline. So what that means is there are projections as to what, in this case, Pentagon spending will be for the next, years. And so now sequestration is supposed to reduce that baseline. But of course, spending is still increasing during that time. It's just decreasing when you look at it relative to what they said they were going to do before, which is, of course, kind of problematic. I mean, if I say to you, hey, I'm going to go out and I'm going to buy a new Porsche that I can't afford, but then I turn around and say, no, sorry, I decided I'm just going to buy a Mercedes. You wouldn't say, well, it's great that you're cutting your spending because you're still buying a fancy car. So that's essentially what we have going on. And from a political perspective, the one of the big problems is that Republicans actually are the group that probably don't want sequestration to go through the most, because we're talking about military spending, and that's kind of been the sacred cow of the right for a long time, just like we have entitlement spending being the sacred cow of the left. And so it's very hard to be optimistic that even though we have a majority in the House, remember that the deal that passed recently to push off the debt ceiling was passed by a majority of Republicans. And knowing that Republicans tend to be are arguably more opposed to sequestration than Democrats on net, it's really hard to be optimistic that we're ever going to see that go through.
It's yes, I have a hard time disagreeing with really any of that analysis. The only the upside, I think, to sequestration is that it's certainly, I think it's harder to cut specific programs because everybody's clearly directly interested in specific programs. When you start talking about the specifics across the board, would theoretically make it easier, but as you said, the loyalty to military spending, particularly by the Republican Party, makes that difficult. We're talking with Jonathan Bydlak from the Coalition to Reduce Spending. When we come back after the break, Jonathan will tell us more about the coalition, what it is working on, and how it believes that it can, in the future, achieve the kind of spending reform that is going to be necessary to bring this country back from this kind of perpetual fiscal cliff that we're on. The Guy Benson Show, Eric Cohn sitting in. Clock's ticking away on Congress's spending problem as it continues to get worse. And we're joined by Jonathan Bydlak from the Coalition to Reduce Spending, a group that wants to bring about the kind of serious reform to our spending and debt problems that are so evident to many, but apparently not to those in Congress. So, Jonathan, what is the Coalition to Reduce Spending? How did it come about? And really, what's the plan to kind of achieve the spending cuts that we all seem to lust after but never materialize?
Sure. So our observation is that if you really think about which political advocacy groups tend to be the most effective, it's those that have kind of a narrow mission, right? A very focused mission. You think about the NRA or the ACLU or the AARP, right? These are the groups that have not only the laser-focused mission, but obviously they have the resources to kind of carry out that mission. And so, on the spending issue, there are many groups that talk about spending, reducing spending, but they're not sort of a single-issue group in the same way as some of these other ones are. And our thought is that we ultimately need, if you will, a special interest that is on the side of cutting spending. Because for most elected officials, if you ask, what are their incentives when it comes to spending, they all tend to be on the side of increasing spending. There are various lobbying groups that are pushing for to increase spending on this program or that program, and of course there are campaign contributions and that sort of thing that are coming from all these special groups. So there kind of needs to be something on the other side of the scale that provides encouragement for elected officials to cut spending. So that's kind of where we fit in. And then to really answer your question, how do you do that? I think there are a lot of people who sort of think about politics in terms of, we just need to elect the right people. If we just get that right person in office, it's going to change everything. Our perspective is a little bit different, which is that what really matters are, again, the incentives that people who are in office face. And a lot of what we have right now is an accountability problem where people say that they're in favor of cutting spending, but there's really no means of holding them accountable. And so you have people who run for office and say, I'm a fiscal conservative, or I care about the national debt, but then they immediately start voting for these big spending bills. And so what we have done is, and you sort of alluded to this earlier, tried to adopt the model that Grover Norquist created for the tax issue, which is a pledge that we ask candidates to sign that basically says that they'll only vote for balanced budgets, that they won't vote for new spending programs that aren't offset in the budget, and that they won't vote to increase borrowing, with the idea being that if we can start to define what it means for someone to be serious about the debt, now there's actually a way for activists and the press and individual voters to hold them accountable should they break those promises once they get into office.
So clearly it's a problem that's really seems to be self-evident to everyone. So how do you grapple, though, against the problem that I kind of alluded to earlier, which is that the problem, of course, with special interests is that every spending bill is very special to someone. So they get the screws turned on particular members of Congress. I mean, do you think building this kind of coalition is enough to resist that? Is it going to make it possible to cut kind of some of the specific fluff, or do we have to, at least in your mind, take a more across the board cutting point of view if we're going to achieve the substantive cuts, the serious big ones that are going to be necessary?
Right. So a couple points to make. One is that I think that the biggest principle that we need to start pushing is the idea that all spending is on the table. As I sort of alluded to earlier, for a long time we've sort of had, Republicans who kind of take Pentagon spending off the table and Democrats who take entitlement spending off the table. And the problem is that if you're serious about balancing the budget, you have to look at the biggest components of that budget. And the things I just mentioned are the biggest components. So when you're borrowing, 40%, and you're only looking at, 15 to 20% of the budget for cuts, it's just not mathematically possible to be able to balance the budget. So one of the big ideas, as I said, is that, this notion that, if you put your pet project on the table, we'll put our pet project on the table. And that is something that's not really, a partisan principle, right? A lot of times, it's easy to start talking about the specifics of cutting this or cutting that. And we're saying, look, let's just start by agreeing that we should put everything on the table. The other thing is that, this notion of offsets, I think, is something that's very powerful, right? If we can actually get people to acknowledge that, okay, I think this new spending program is a good idea, that's fine. But if we're going to implement that, we need to cut from somewhere else. And that's a very moderate, a very rational position to take. So it's not saying, well, you can't decide that, we want to have some sort of government program for this or that. But it's saying that if that's what's decided, we have to be serious about the fiscal implications of what we're doing. And I think that's another great starting point and a way of sort of, bringing together both the left and right on this issue. And if we can start to get people to agree to those kind of principles, then we can have the detailed discussion about how much do we cut from where. I think if you were running a business and you kind of had to cut back in your business because, revenue was down, you probably wouldn't go and just kind of cut everything. You wouldn't say, well, we're cutting everything 40% across the board. You would look at it and sort of assess on a program by program basis whether or not that you have the right amount of spending. But that discussion, to me, is kind of a second order discussion, a discussion that we have to have down the road once we get buy-in that everything should be on the table and that we really shouldn't be adding new things.
Jonathan, real quickly, where can people learn more?
Yeah, reducespending.org. Fan us on Facebook, send us a message, and get your elected officials to sign.
That's the best way to get is pressure from the voters is the best way to get people in Congress on board, and it's clearly, I think, what we need to do. Jonathan, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Guy Benson Show. Eric Cohn sitting in. We'll be back.